the greatest knowledge of Iraq, and which had produced a mammoth 13 volumes on every aspect of the country. Were you therefore told what the State Department had done? Because as you know, they'd done this huge project called The Future of Iraq.
Yeah, but I didn't know about that. I wasn't told.
They didn't tell you that?
No.
Do you find that strange?
I don't know, yeah, maybe so, I don't know.
In London, Mr. Blair was emphasising to Parliament that he was giving post-war planning a high priority.
That you cannot engage in military conflict and ignore the aftermath. If we get to the stage of military conflict, we've also got to have a very proper, worked-out plan as to what happens afterwards.
10 days later, Mr. Blair travelled to Washington for his third Iraq summit with President Bush. For all his assurances to Parliament about the importance of post-war planning, a leaked memo of the meeting records only a brief discussion about it. For Mr. Blair, the priority remained the need to get the Americans behind a UN resolution specifically authorising the invasion to get new Labour on board in Britain. The President's National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, assured Mr. Blair a great deal of work on post-war planning was in hand by Donald Rumsfeld's new Reconstruction Unit. But should Tony Blair have been convinced, for months, planning had been wreathed in confusion.
We knew that there was a dysfunctional administration. I think we underestimated, to be honest, the extent to which dealing with the State Department wasn't necessarily going to result in what we wanted, because the Department of Defense was calling the shots.
So confusing was the picture that the new head of the British Army, General Jackson, dispatched General Cross to Washington to investigate.
General Mike said to me, I want you to go out and find out if this is the main focal point for planning in Washington. Talk to the people, live with them, find out what's going on, and let me know whether this is the focal point.
So it was regarded as critical to find out where the planning was taking place, never mind what planning was done in the first instance.
Yeah.
Didn't that tell you something about the state of post-war planning?
Around 1 million people march on London opposed to war in Iraq.
They moved down Piccadilly, a gathering which the march organisers were already describing as the biggest political protest to be seen.
More demonstrate in 600 cities around the world.
With just 4 weeks before the invasion, General Garner invited all government departments to gather together for the first time at Fort McNair for what he called a rock drill, a military term used by field commanders to describe a rehearsal, testing the strength of a plan by moving around rocks as imaginary units.
That was the idea behind this rock drill, that we would have everybody come together and each one of our elements of ORHA would brief what they would do for the first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, out to 120 days. We were nowhere close to having a plan at the end of that drill.
I remember some of the presentations going into great detail about what they thought would need to happen and be put in place post-war. But in other areas, very, very thin areas, stood debating, for example, what the currency would be. How would the economy be run? Would it be run on a US dollar? Would it be run on a Swiss dinar? And those sorts of debates. How were you going to kick-start the economy? How were you going to pick up on, get the ministries up and running and so forth?
It was made clear to Whitehall by General Cross's nightly cables from the British Embassy in Washington just how much was left to do and how little time there was to do it.
I was shocked, if I'm honest about it. I kept saying to myself, there must be more to it than this. We were writing reports back to Whitehall and to my immediate chain of command. But I just kept saying to myself, we must be missing a trick. There must be something else happening here. And I think Jay felt the same. But after about 3 weeks or so, one began to realise that there wasn't anything else. This was it.
In Washington, General Garner was having to put together a plan with one hand tied behind his back. Douglas Feith, who Rumsfeld had put in charge of the aftermath, was vetting Garner's key appointments to his reconstruction unit.
If you didn't pass the political smell test, so to speak, you weren't going to Iraq.
What was the political smell test?
It seemed to be the standard kind of things. You had to be hardcore Republican. You didn't have to be a fire-breathing evangelical, but that helped. And you had to have given money, and you had to be young, so you wouldn't have gained any wisdom. And you had to be clearly identifiable as someone who wouldn't raise any hell while they were over there in terms of what might be going wrong or not succeeding.
Good evening. War with Iraq now seems an even more realistic prospect after the day's events here in Britain and in the Gulf.
While American planes have been increasing the number of strikes from the air, the troops on the ground in Kuwait are finessing their battle plans.
First tonight, has the war with Iraq effectively begun?
Half the carrier fleet of the world's only superpower will soon be assembled in one place. It's hard to imagine that they won't be used.
By now, the Americans had been joined by British forces and were training in the desert. The total invasion force was down to 170,000 because of Donald Rumsfeld's insistence on a light US footprint afterwards. This was less than half the number Colin Powell and some other generals thought necessary to stabilize Iraq after Saddam had been toppled. General Cross expressed his misgivings at a private lunch with Secretary Rumsfeld.
I said to him, I can't remember my exact words, but I said to him I was concerned with the total size of the force that would be in place once the military campaign was over to deal with whatever followed. I don't think he didn't agree with me. He decided how he was going to run the campaign, and as a senior member of the leadership team, he made his decisions, and I quite understood, where he was coming from. I just didn't agree with him.
Was that the last time he spoke to you at lunch?
It was actually, yes.
The armed services chiefs were also concerned that not enough thought had been given how to stabilize Iraq after the invasion.
It was a constant underlying theme. There was a worry about it. It was niggling all the time. There was this sense of, the Americans are going to be able to, do this, pull this one off in this complex post-conflict arena.
But now it was too late to translate these niggles into a first-order concern. 3 weeks before the war, General Franks came to London to address the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Boyce, and the heads of the armed services. Franks is said to have given an upbeat assessment of post-war planning. The atmosphere was strongly supportive of the US approach and of Franks himself. We've been told that for all their concerns about the aftermath, none of the heads of the armed services pressed General Franks on the matter. All their energy had to be focused on the battle ahead.
There are, I think, 2 or 3 ships yet to come in. I would have thought 4 or 5 days would pretty much complete the whole logistic piece. But even if it were today, it's good to go.
In Washington, General Garner's reconstruction team